Tim, the floor is yours, and I hope everyone will enjoy your presentation. I think the first slide is very promising.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Galimas, for the very kind invitation. As you mentioned, we've known each other for a number of years, and Galimas wrote a terrific piece on the Lithuanian presidency of the EU in the last JCMS AR, which I co-edit. I would also just like to thank you all for coming. It's 5 o'clock. It's probably a time when you prefer to be doing other things than listening to some academic waffle on about Britain and the EU. So given that, I'm going to sort of downplay the theories of European integration stuff and keep it more, I hope, a bit more interesting, engaged, perhaps even slightly more journalistic, but we can refer back to some of the more theoretical, conceptual debates, perhaps in Q&A, if you want to. Okay. My first slide here, I like to use lots of pictures, so there'll be not much text for many of my images, many of my slides, but plenty of images. This was actually, and I want to mention The Economist. This was actually a front cover of The Economist at the time that David Cameron made his referendum speech, the promise of a referendum in January 2014. This really is the gambler, Cameron the Gambler, and it's a theme that I want to come back to on a couple of occasions during the course of the talk. Okay, let me take my watch so I can keep an eye on time. Okay, so really what I want to do in the course of the next 45 minutes is to address 4 questions. Firstly, what exactly, or why is Brexit or British exit actually on the agenda now? Secondly, how is Europe, the theme of Europe, playing out in the British general election campaign, which is going on at the moment? Thirdly, to address whether Britain will actually leave. And fourthly, what the consequences of a Brexit would be. Before I really start engaging on these 4 particular questions, I want to say a couple of things. Firstly, we might ask ourselves the question, sorry, the PowerPoint hasn't quite come out exactly the way I would have liked it, but never mind. Why is Britain threatening exit when the EU actually is now much wider, it's more liberal, and much more Anglophone, if not sometimes even more Anglophile than it has ever been. Moreover, Britain has managed to negotiate privileged terms of membership. Britain has the rebate, or the abatement to use its more formal terms, and it's under no obligation to join the euro. Why? Why would we risk it? Why would we risk it? And I want to start off by saying a few things about underlying themes of British politics, which I think are really important for us to understand why Britain thinks the way that it does. And these 3 themes are as follows. Firstly, a self-perception of superiority. Secondly, the different or the island mentality. And thirdly, the distrust of ideas or the kind of anti-intellectualism. I want to say a couple of things about this. Firstly, the self-perception of superiority. Britons tend to think that we are better than the rest. Britons tend to refer back to the fact that we have the mother of all parliaments, the wonderful House of Commons that you can see. The fact that the real mother of parliaments might be in Greece, or we might say the longest standing parliament's actually in Iceland, is a fact which is glossed over in British political discourse. This kind of notion of superiority and we are better than the rest was very well encapsulated by Margaret Thatcher, the former British Prime Minister. She referred to the fact that since Magna Carta, the Great Charter of 1215, we, the British, have pioneered and developed representative institutions to stand as bastions of freedom. Yeah? Margaret Thatcher, at the time of the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution, rather than be good and diplomatic and go to France and say, yes, liberté, égalité, fraternité, they were important contributions to the modern world, went there and reminded everyone that freedom really started with the Magna Carta. Tact is not often an attribute that goes with Britain's attitudes towards the EU. But it's also worth remembering that not that long ago, at the time when my great-grandparents were in their primary schools, they were reminded that a quarter of the world was painted red, this empire upon which the sun never sets. To some extent, Britain is still coping with the question of what its place is in the world, even here in the 21st century. Indeed, the second theme that I think is worth mentioning is this sort of different island mentality and the notions of place. Margaret Thatcher, a name that I keep having to refer to in this talk, in the Conservative Party conference in 1999, famously said, all of our troubles have come from Europe, and all of our solutions have come from the English-speaking world. It's not just the Conservative Party. This gentleman here, Hugh Gateskill, was leader of the Labour Party in the 1950s and early 1960s, and at the time that Harold Macmillan was first negotiating possible British entry into the EU, into the European community as it then was, he gave a famous speech at the Labour Party conference talking about 1,000 years of history, the dangers of throwing away 1,000 years of history for the benefit of being able to sell washing machines in Dusseldorf. Yeah? It's kind of notion that it goes against. But also, it underlines a bigger kind of existential question of place for Britain. Winston Churchill, after the Second World War, talked about the three interlocking circles. Yeah? The three interlocking circles being the Empire, or we can now say the Empire and Commonwealth, the United States, and Europe. And Britain was kind of in the middle of those three particular, overlapping circles. And it's a question of which of those we have to belong to if we're forced to make a choice. The final point I want to make, a general point, is about distrust of ideas, ideologies, and anti-intellectualism. There's a nice quote of George Steiner, who once said, England, interestingly he referred to England, is blessed with a powerful mediocrity of mind. It has saved you from communism and it saved you from fascism. In the end, you don't care enough about ideas to suffer their consequences. What's interesting is that in Britain, I'm sure a number of you here have probably been to the UK, in contrast to, say, Central Europe, where in Central Europe you're very proud to be docent, doctor, ad name, PhD, blah, 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 blah. In the UK, if you have a PhD like me, you're some kind of strange, weird, eccentric, not something to be proud of. Very, very few British politicians will actually admit that they have a PhD. Right? Gordon Brown, British Prime Minister for a number of years, I'm always, when I remind my students that he actually has a PhD in history, everyone is amazed because he never ever called himself Dr. Gordon Brown. It links into a broader sense in which the driving forces, the real ideas behind European integration have not been British. The possible exception of Roy Jenkins, who was the British Commissioner, President of the Commission in the end of the 1970s. It's often been, and I put three Frenchmen here, often been the French who've been more significant in terms of the intellectual driving forces of ideas. Okay, three big points that I just wanted to mention at the beginning. The other important contextual issue is an issue of image. The EU's image in the UK is very bad and has been for a number of years. Particularly linked in the past with a common agricultural policy, the notion of wine lakes and butter mountains. Of course, a number of you here studying the EU will know that those are of the past because of changes to the common agricultural policy. But still, if you go out onto the streets of Birmingham, where I live, most people would still think that agriculture in Britain is still, or in the EU is still governed by a common agricultural policy that creates inefficiency, that creates butter mountains and wine lakes. Okay, so I want to now more formally address that first question about why Brexit is on the agenda. And it has a lot to do with some of the continuities and some of the changes of British politics over a longer period of time. Okay, I probably shouldn't say this in front of Ramona's great students who study the EU, but let's say it, which is for most people the EU is boring, right? Let's be honest about it. Most things to do with the EU are not the kind of things that really make us very, very excited. There are many more exciting things in the world sometimes than the EU, particularly the complexities of the European Union. Of course, one of the important things to emphasise here is that actually more and more British people tend to get their news as such from the TV and from radio than necessarily from the print media, so we shouldn't overemphasise the role of the Eurosceptic media, but nonetheless it does play an important role. Secondly, what's striking is about the politicians. Going back to 1975, here we have Margaret Thatcher dressed up in her famous outfit with all of the flags of the 9 member states at the time, advocating, yes, Britain should stay in. In contrast, in more recent times, the debates now have largely focused around this individual, a man called Nigel Farage, the leader of the UK Independence Party. In many respects, the Eurosceptic discourse is much more prevalent amongst politicians now than it was back in 1975. The second important issue or thing about public opinion in the UK is that it's quite variable. It's varied significantly over time. In other words, it's a theme on which most British people actually don't seem to have a particularly strong view one way or another. And actually, if you look at some of the statistics from Eurobarometer and other places, Euroscepticism in the UK is not necessarily that much more significant or more pronounced than in a lot of other member states of the EU. A more significant reason, I think, why Brexit is on the agenda and why Britain has a troubled relationship with the EU is to do with both questions of identity and questions related to the state. In terms of identity, what I think is important, and some of my colleagues in Birmingham disagree with me about this point, so feel free to disagree with me in Q&A if you want, but I would argue that Britons tend to have a rather monolithic view of identity. Right? So this notion that if I stand on this stage and I say I'm both British and European, that somehow my declaration of my Europeanness is somehow diluting my Britishness. Yeah? That there's a kind of trade-off in a lot of English, a lot of British kind of viewpoints. This would contrast, for example, if a Frenchman was standing here, a Frenchman would feel that there's no contradiction between being both French and European. Indeed, one's Frenchness is only enhanced by being European. Maybe the Irish can pass a view on this as well. The second issue is to do with the state. Now, I don't know within your, I know that the audience is a bit mixed, but within your studies of the EU, you may well have read the work of Vivian Schmidt and her book Democracy in the European Union. Does that ring a bell with anybody? No? You should do. It's a great book that Vivian wrote. And one of the points that she makes about that is she makes a contrast between certain states that tend to be federal and those states that tend to be unitary. Okay? She's making a contrast between countries like Germany and countries like the UK, for example, or Britain. Of course, Britain's a bit complicated with devolution. But what's kind of important in the British sense is that because it's historically a rather centralised state, then this notion of pooling sovereignty with a supranational body is more problematic. It's much easier if you have a federal state and you're brought up thinking in federal terms to accept the idea that certain powers or certain decisions should be made at particular levels of decision making. Okay. So in British sense, again, this idea of pooling sovereignty somehow seems to be undermining this great institution, the British state. A final underlying point, which I think is worth emphasising, and why Britons tend to think the way that they do, is that Europe is seen largely in cost-benefit terms. It's a cost-benefit calculation. You weigh up the costs and the benefits, you consider, yes, it's better that we stay in, or yes, it will be better if we were to leave. This is, say, different to a number of other countries where, for example, there may be a civilizational choice being crucial, right? So in a country like Lithuania, for example, you your attachment to the EU is partly civilizational. It's partly to do with your pre-1991 past. It's to say where you belong, and it's to say that you don't want anything to do with the big brother, not quite, well, yes, next door, if you think of Kaliningrad, it is next door, but I would say largely to the east. And at heart, why Brexit we start to think about Brexit being important on the agenda is because this cost-benefit calculation means that Europe is a choice, it's not a given. Okay? And the point at which the British Conservative Party started to become more Eurosceptic, which is really important, is around the time of the Maastricht Treaty. Why? Because up until that point, this is a gross simplification, but basically true. Up until that point, European integration was basically about markets. Okay? It was largely about markets. And the British Conservatives were positive about the idea of that. Maastricht, in the early 1990s, changed the calculus. The EU became involved in a whole range of other policy areas, ones to which British Conservatives in particular felt that it was not beneficial for Britain to be part of. Okay. Margaret Thatcher, I've already shown you this famous picture of her with her EC flags in 1975, strong advocate. It was the British Conservative Party, after all, that took the UK in. It was the British Conservative Party that began the first negotiations in the 1960s. But from that enthusiasm, we've seen a gradual increase in Euroscepticism. Famously, Margaret Thatcher, this was her last speech in the House of Commons as Prime Minister. It was no, 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 no to a single currency, no to the Commission, no to further integration. In contrast, what we see with the Labour Party has been a shift in the other direction. So in 1983, the Labour Party campaigned on a manifesto to leave the EU. Sorry, the European Community, Economic Community as it was then, under this gentleman, Michael Foot. But we see in more recent times that the Labour Party have been much more pro-European. And just as the Conservative position has shifted away from positive attitudes towards the EU, as the European Union has become involved in more areas than just markets, so the Labour Party has been persuaded to be more positive about integration as it has become involved in other areas like social policy, for example. So there's a famous speech that Jacques Delors, the then President of the European Commission, made to the Trade Union Congress, the body that brings together all the trade unionists in the UK. The TUC has historically very close ties with the Labour Party. A famous speech known as the Frère Jacques, the Brother Jacques speech, in which he convinced the Labour movement that actually, you know what, this integration, this European integration project is really positive for you. It's not just about markets, it's not just a capitalist club. I've mentioned some of the broader underlying factors. Let's bring this story further up to date, up to 2010. Three really important changes in more recent times that have really accelerated or emphasised the Eurosceptic arguments and put Brexit much more seriously on the agenda. The three changes that I'll mention briefly are the coalition government, the rise of UKIP, and the Eurozone crisis. Let's take the first of those. The coalition government that was formed in 2010 between the Conservatives and the Lib Dems is significant in European terms for a number of reasons, but one reason why it's quite significant is because the traditional repository of the anti-politics vote was the Liberal Democrats. Okay? With the Liberal Democrats part of the government, you can't exercise your protest vote to vote for the Lib Dems. So what we've seen in by-elections, which are elections when, for example, a British MP dies and you have to have another election. I know in the electoral system in Lithuania you have these from time to time as well. So because of So in these by-elections and the European Parliament elections, that protest vote hasn't gone to the Lib Dems as it has done so much in the past, but has gone much more to UKIP. So the United Kingdom Independence Party, for example, won, or got the largest proportion of the vote in the European elections last year. The second issue is the rise of UKIP, but crucially there's been a change in UKIP. Now, I'm no fan of UKIP and I'm no fan of Nigel Farage, but sometimes you have to recognise even your enemies are very skillful. And Nigel Farage is a very skillful politician who shifted the debate and the appeal of UKIP from a "we hate Europe" to something more subtle and more effective. Essentially, he's picked on the issue of immigration. Now, I don't have to talk too much to an audience like this about the consequences of the 2004 enlargement. You know what happened, right? Why is it that this is quite an effective message for UKIP to play? Well, historically, immigration into the UK tended to go to the big cities. So into London, into Birmingham, into Liverpool, these kind of places. But after 2004, from the new accession states like Lithuania, a lot of people have moved to places like Southampton, to Slough, to Peterborough, many more of the smaller cities and towns of the UK where you have historically not so much tradition of migration. Why does that matter? Because although economically one could argue about the economic benefits and disadvantages of immigration, there are social consequences of increased numbers. I'm not making a point for or against immigration, it's a kind of fact. And what UKIP have been very effective at doing is saying, look, your primary school, your basic school, for your elementary school, for your kids, 10 years ago, each class, probably mother tongue was 85–90% English. Now it's down to 50%, right? All of these kids speaking in these strange languages in the playground. Or you go to the doctor's surgery and you see that the 4 people in front of you, when you want to see the doctor, are all speaking funny European languages. Yeah? Okay? I'm not saying that I think these languages are funny. You understand the point that I'm trying to make, which is a crucial point, which is that one of the advantages of the advantages of the European Union are often very intangible. They're not things that can be felt so much. Yeah? It's very difficult for us often as citizens to understand what the benefit of us being part of the single market is. Right? But some of the disadvantages, or some of the consequences, I would prefer to say, some of the consequences of EU membership can be very tangible. Yeah? If you see the school that your kids go to, or you see that the doctor's surgery that you go to, you can see the influx of people, and you think, am I getting such a good deal myself? And if a politician stands up and says, no, you're not getting such a good deal because there are all these foreigners, then you might be persuaded to vote in that particular way. The third aspect, which is important, is the Eurozone crisis. You're a Eurozone country, I don't need to talk to you about Eurozone crises. Apart from to say, I discovered that Varoufakis has a master's degree from the University of Birmingham. I don't know whether that's a thing to be proud of or not. But anyway, he does. So there we are. A fourth change, which I think is quite important, it's a subtle change, but an important change, was that David Cameron, when he became leader of the Conservative Party, promised that he would take the Conservatives out of the European People's Party, or the EPP-ED, as it was called at that time, and to create a new group. So the Conservatives were at the driving force of creating the European Conservatives and Reformist Group. This matters, I think, because it has diminished British influence, it's diminished Conservative influence. For example, David Cameron was not very enthusiastic about the idea of Jean-Claude Juncker becoming Commission President. If the Conservatives had still been in the EPP, they may well have been able to have got a different Spitzenkandidat for the 2014 EP elections. A whole series of reforms, get enough reforms to then come back to the British electorate and say, look at what I managed to get, extract from Brussels, please vote therefore in favour of the changes. It is a huge gamble based not least on hubris, but one might argue for David Cameron, maybe it's a very sensible party strategy. Right? This fractious Conservative Party was managed to be sewn together on the basis of this promise of a possible referendum. If David Cameron doesn't win this election, it doesn't matter. He doesn't have to worry about it. If he does win this election, it may be a bit difficult, but at least he would then have a mandate to go and negotiate something and then hold a referendum. So I want to say a little bit about the general election, and I know that I can waffle on about the British general election campaign in great detail, but I want to say a few things which I think are quite important. British politics has changed since the old days of just being a two-party arrangement. For the last few years, we can probably say we've had 2.5 parties, a 2.5-party system, but now we have a whole bunch of other players that were important. I don't know if you're aware, there was a big leaders debate in the UK last week in which all 7 of these individuals were on the podiums, at the podiums arguing their case. Why do I say this? Because what matters here is it's highly likely that no party will win an overall majority in this election. Highly likely. That's not to say it won't happen. Things can change in the campaign, but at the moment it's highly likely that no party will have an overall majority. That means that some kind of a deal has to be struck, and some part of that deal may have some kind of an impact on the possibility of Brexit. So you may well, hopefully you know who this man is, David Cameron. Hopefully you may have an idea that this is Ed Miliband, the leader of the Labour Party. Hopefully you know that this is Nick Clegg, the Deputy Prime Minister and leader of the Lib Dems. These 4 individuals, I bet you, I tell you what, if anyone can name all 4 of those, I'll give you €1. I do this with my students sometimes. Can anyone name, not an ambassador, no. But if anyone can name all 4 of these? No? Don't worry. I do, as I say, I do this sometimes with my students, safe in the knowledge that my euros will stay in the pocket. And I do offer them euros rather than pounds for entry to the EU. Well, this is Nicola Sturgeon. She's the First Minister of Scotland. The SNP are likely to do very well in the general election and win lots of seats in Scotland. This is Leanne Wood. She's the leader of Plaid Cymru, which is the Welsh nationalists. They will win a few seats. I don't know how many, but they will win a few. This is Nigel Farage. Probably you're more aware of this individual than anybody else. And this woman is Natalie Bennett. She's the leader of the Greek Party. The Greens have 1 seat currently in Parliament. I've also put out here, sorry, it hasn't perfectly come up, but don't forget this group of people, Northern Ireland. I think it's time for lots of people like me to mug up on our knowledge of Northern Irish politics, because, for example, the Democratic Unionist Party may well return about 8 seats. That might be the balance of power in any post-election scenario. In other words, it's a very, very fluid situation. Now, this man has promised a referendum. Ed Miliband has said that Britain won't have a referendum because he says that it's more important to deal with jobs, to deal with the economy, to deal with the National Health Service. Nick Clegg is not that enthusiastic about the idea of a referendum, but possibly would be persuadable. Nicola Sturgeon possibly could go for another referendum. Farage, of course, wants a referendum. And Natalie Bennett is in favour of a possible referendum. In other words, the point that I want to make is that although the call for a referendum and the promise for a referendum was driven by the Prime Minister, David Cameron, there are others within, and I should also mention the Democratic Unionist Party, who have some very disturbing views on social liberal matters, which I was reminded about by some friends recently. They also are in favour of a referendum. In other words, it's possible that even if David Cameron doesn't get a majority government, that whatever minority government, whatever coalition government is formed after the election might have a referendum promise at its core. We just have to wait and see. In terms of the polls, just to give you an idea, the Labour and the Conservatives are basically neck and neck at the moment. This is the UKIP vote down here on 14%, the Lib Dems on 7%, and the Greens around 4.6%. Given the way the British electoral system works, Labour and Conservatives will still win the overwhelming majority of the seats. Okay? in some respects the most interesting, and it's a shame actually I didn't put it on this, well, it'd be difficult to put it on this graph. The Scottish National Party vote could be quite crucial. The Scottish Nationalists could win 40-odd seats in Scotland. Okay, just one brief, this is just a graph just to show you about the candidates, prospective candidates running in the general election and their positions. I just really want to flag up two things. One, you know, what a surprise, it's UKIP politicians here who basically want to leave the EU. We would expect that. What we can see here is that actually the number of Conservatives who would like to leave is not that great, okay? Although that there are a significant number who, in terms of strongly disagree, here a number who would disagree, but the overwhelming majority still think it's in Britain's interest to stay part of the European Union, right? What's crucial here is that it may well have been party management that made Cameron call the referendum pledge, but it was driven by a more vocal minority in the Conservative Party rather than the majority. It's the vocal Conservative minority that have been more significant. Now, if there is going to be a campaign after the election for a referendum, it's going to be driven partly by this man who likes to show himself always having a pint in hand. Nigel Farage always likes to demonstrate he's not like the identikit politicians of Miliband, Clegg and Cameron. He's a normal guy who enjoys a pint of beer down the pub. The fact that he was educated at a very expensive school and was a stockbroker for many years, let's not worry about that. Let's just think of him as a nice, ordinary bloke down the pub. In contrast, the pro-European lobby, I would say, have been very fractious, badly organised, and rather elite organised. There's a group called the European Movement, which exists, I think, in all member states, which hasn't been particularly effective. There's a business lobby called British Influence, which hasn't been very effective. I would suggest that if there is going to be a campaign, then these actually have to start working together. Moreover, they've got to start talking they've got to stop talking just to themselves and actually talk to ordinary voters. This man may not be my favourite politician in the country, but he does at least go out and talk to ordinary people, or at least the ordinary people he can find in the pubs when he drinks. Okay, let's go a little bit further. Apologies for the slightly rude image here. But this brings us to another scenario. So let's assume the campaign is lost. Let's assume Cameron wins the election. We have a referendum. The referendum basically says we want to leave. Fine. Okay. What next? Okay. So we've just said, maybe I can say it in French because I shouldn't say it in English. But you know, va du faire couler. We just said that to the EU. But please, what we would like is we would like trade with other EU member states. We would like trade deals with other states, we'd like FDI flows, and we want the City of London to remain significant. These are going to be really important issues that would have to be tackled. Yeah? The trade issue, the access to trade, the access to the market, foreign direct investment, and the position of the City of London. Yeah? The City of London is worth about 1/6 of the entire UK economy. The City of London, I mean here the financial heart of the UK. So what would Brexit mean? Some people suggest, well, brilliant, we would leave and we would go to global Britain. Global Britain. Not even Great Britain, but global Britain. And little Europe will be left here in a little cul-de-sac. Others would suggest that if we left, we'd be left as a kind of little England. Indeed, a little England, perhaps even less than a little UK. So what are the possible scenarios? I'm drawing here on some work done by friend and co-author Nat Copsey about potential scenarios. There are 3 possible scenarios that I'll sketch out. One is the kind of semi-detached scenario. This is where Britain kind of goes down the Norway route. Britain would remain part of the European, or be part of the European economic area, would have access to the single market. It would still have to pay some kind of contribution if we imagined that it would follow the Norwegian road. And of course, it would be subject to all of the decisions made that affect and regulate the single market, but at the same time, would have absolutely no voice in terms of what decisions were made. A second scenario is the special deal route, or you might think of the Swiss route. Switzerland has a whole array of bilateral agreements which it has struck with the EU. Well, an awful lot of EU leaders would not like to have another special case Switzerland. It's complicated, it's difficult, it's time-consuming. Would it be so beneficial to the UK? Probably not, if we couldn't extract decent deals, terms of arrangement. And the third option is really the wilderness option. Basically, that Britain would only trade as a kind of member of the WTO, would be outside of all European institutions. It would be essentially, you know, like a kind of Japan or Algeria or Mozambique or whatever, negotiating with the EU. I'm very happy to come back to some of these in Q&A because I know time-wise I need to move on. Firstly, Britain has been this awkward, difficult, problematic partner, right? Hooray, say all other EU officials, we get rid of those bloody difficult, awkward Brits. Life will be much better. Well, Britain isn't the only awkward partner from time to time. Other countries can be pretty difficult too. A second consequence is you are likely to have an EU which would be much more dominated by Germany, or probably more dominated perhaps by the French and the Germans. It would probably be a less liberal Europe. It would probably be a less outward-looking Europe. It would be a Europe less enthusiastic about the idea of kind of enlargement, deregulation, and the like. Moreover, I don't know if Yes Minister makes its way over to Lithuania, you would lose some fantastic civil servants. Some of the best civil servants in Brussels are British. I'm not just saying that as a Brit. That's a commonly recognised fact. Some really talented individuals who would go. It would also change certain policy areas in a significant way. So, for example, if we think about defence policies, there's only really two countries that matter in the EU in terms of defence, and that's Britain and France. Now, we think of other areas where defence or other organisations concerned with defence, so we may say that doesn't matter. Okay, but let's bear in mind that if we're worried, if we think about defence within the EU, then without Britain, we would be reliant largely on France. So, two final slides. Am I doing okay for time? Two final slides. One thing I want to say is, in many respects, the major kind of challenges that we face in the EU today, so the demographic challenge, major challenge facing Europe as a whole, we're not producing enough kids, basically. Well, I don't need to tell this audience what a kind of danger that this man, the challenge this man poses. Energy security, another major challenge, and global competitiveness, trying to deal with the fact that the 21st century, which is not a European century, an Asian or no one century, we have to be able to compete in that kind of market. Would Brexit help the EU closer to meeting any of these targets? Not really. Would it help Britain meet some of these targets, challenges that it faces? I don't think so. And so my final point, and I'm not just saying that because I'm in Vilnius, but it's a kind of lament. It's an if-only point, right? I remember in 2005, this man, Tony Blair, British Prime Minister, Britain had the presidency of the EU at the time. He went to Strasbourg and he gave a famous speech. It was just after the French and the Dutch had voted no. Everyone was very gloomy in European institutions. And Tony Blair got up and said, you know, what Europe needs right now is leadership, and we should give Europe leadership. The problem is that Britain has catastrophically failed to use its potential for power and influence. There's a famous book by Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. I think that British politicians in Europe could write a book, How to Lose Friends and Fail to Influence People. That's been Britain's way of dealing with European institutions over the last decade, if not more. And I think in particular, the 2004 enlargement, yeah, we could make a strong case to say it was us that played a key role in getting countries like you guys in, yeah, against pressures from countries like France that were less enthusiastic. And yet, catastrophically, just a few months after that, we then make a big song and dance over the budget, and we make a big song and dance over our rebate. We then castigate all of you lot as terrible East European migrants coming over taking our jobs. We have lost the power and influence that we could have had. And if only I could turn back the clock 10 years at least, I would. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I'm sure there are a lot of questions after this well-structured and entertaining presentation. Before opening the floor to questions, I would like to ask you one to warm up the audience. You mentioned the review of the balance of competences that was initiated by the British government. I think it's probably unprecedented analysis in the whole history of European Union of a member state undertaking such a detailed analysis of what powers are allocated to the EU, which ones are left to member states or to the regions in those member states which have more federal structure. So it's really surprising that this huge exercise was so much consumed, so much time, resources, and then after the government got the summary, the results, there is very little of it being used in public debate. So the question is, how do you see this whole exercise influencing the actions of the next government, especially if it is led by David Cameron, in trying to renegotiate British membership in the EU? Because this review was meant to serve as a basis for renegotiations. And now we don't hear much about what would be concrete demands of Britain in terms of what its government would like to renegotiate in order to present its case for British voters to stay in the EU. What would be your guess? What would be the key points to be proposed for Brussels to be renegotiated?
Okay, thank you very much for that. So, I would say, I put the image of David Cameron as the gambler, right? And in some senses, any negotiation is like a game of poker, right? So to some extent, you don't want to necessarily show your cards too many of your cards in advance, because then everybody knows what you're going to push for. So in a sense, I'm not surprised that there hasn't been much debate and discussion about what the demands would be. What comes out from the balance of competences review is that broadly most areas are kind of okay and seem to be appropriate. And I think that that would form part of Cameron's rhetoric to say, I don't need to go to Brussels and change absolutely everything, because this activity undertaken by civil servants has shown that in a number of areas it works quite well. Okay? Nonetheless, he will have to come back with something. He has to win some concession, right? Because that's his strategy is based on that, so he has to show success. Why does he have to show something? Because there would be a referendum. What would be the main concern for the ordinary voters at that time of the referendum? I don't think it would be something about preserving the City of London. After all, bankers don't have a particularly good reputation after the crisis anyway. I think it would be something much more to do with migration, and I suspect it would be something to do with not quite the end of free movement labour, because that's a founding principle, but something whereby it could be seen that migration, or probably more significantly benefit, what's called benefit tourism, could be tackled. Now, actually, David Cameron could do a lot of that without actually negotiating with his European partners. But let's not worry about that. The important thing for him is that he has to go to Brussels. He seemed to get sort of an agreement on a piece of paper and then be able to come home and say that. So I think it would be something to do with free movement would be at the core.
Okay. So, other questions?
In case of Britain leaving the UK, what do you think would be the future of transnational trade and investment partnership with the US?
Thank you for a fascinating lecture. And especially interesting for me was your part about a story that Britain tells for its peoples, about the exceptionalism of Britain, about the stereotypes that you have about yourselves. And I think that that is the narrative that is highly played by Mr. Farage, and he's playing it very successfully, the anti-EU stereotypes. So this big narrative is leading the coalition against Europe as far as I see. But the question is, do we have any good big narrative for Europe in Britain? And what good narrative the influence groups like Britain's influence or the European movement could use in Britain? The narrative that would be beneficial for staying in the European Union. Thank you.
Why do you think the current immigration flow from the Eastern Europe is seen as such a threat when you can actually experience massive immigration from the ex-colonies in the 60s, 70s, and so on, and it was actually from a more culturally diverse and maybe even distant backgrounds, and could possibly, end up in a more, more crucial, social consequences than the current inflow. And why do you think this is seen as a more critical and more threatening immigration flow than the previous ones?
Shall we?
So about immigration first, you're right that in terms of this, the 2004 wave of immigration is different to previous waves. So one has to be careful about how one phrases these things, but it's true that walking down the street, an immigrant from 2004 accession states isn't so clearly obvious on first glance than the previous waves, indeed. Why is it seen as a threat? Well, one of the things that I wanted to try and say here, which I think is important, is it's the impact on public services that seems to be very important. Yeah, that is the thing that Farage in particular has been very, very effective at pushing. To say that it's seen as a threat because your chances of getting a council house, your chances of going and getting an operation in the hospital, your chances of getting your kid into the school that you want your kid to get into is diminished because of this kind of competition that has come in from Central and Eastern Europe. Plus, another important factor, which I didn't mention before, which I think is important, is if you look at the demographics of support for UKIP, right? It's the lowest socioeconomic groups that tend to support UKIP. And what they have seen is, because they're at the bottom of the labour market, they have seen Polish plumbers come in and undercut their prices, and then they don't have a chance to work. Or what's often happened, and this is really bad, is that labour from the accession states, they're often not paid minimum wage, not properly, they work in the grey economy, which is terrible for them, they're being exploited, plus the fact that for the native British workers, if you like, then those jobs and opportunities have gone too. So the demonisation comes really in terms of the impact on jobs, the impact on wages, impact on public services. The problem is that economic, we can see the stats which show that migrants from the accession states contribute more to the UK economy than take out. Okay? But that isn't that is a statistic that doesn't get through, whereas the narrative, I can't go and see the doctor today, or because there are X number of people in front of me, I can't get my kid into the school that I want to because of all of these Lithuanians here. Yeah, that's the kind of narrative that Farage et al. Has been effective at using. I hope that answers.
Yeah, I was just wondering, why is it seen different than the previous one, than the 60s? Because I think they experienced the same issues in the previous immigration flows. But why is it seen as a...
Well, you can't blame the EU on previous.
Oh, yeah, of course.
I mean, that's a crucial difference. So why it's effective is that Farage can get up and say, well, the reason why these immigrants are all here is because of the EU. We get out of the EU and suddenly our immigration problems disappear. Okay. That's pretty much what his rhetoric is. So it's linked to the EU. That segues nicely to the question. I think it's a terrific question about the narrative, the good narrative. This is one of my laments, that in the UK there isn't a strong enough narrative about the positives that we get from it. You know, when I talk to officials from European Commission or Parliament in the UK, they talk about things like abolishing roaming charges, and it's like, well, yeah, that's great, but that's hardly a kind of narrative that will get someone to stand on the barricades and say, yes, I'm going to fight for the abolition of mobile phone roaming charges. Yeah? It's not really liberté, égalité, fraternité. Yeah? The kinds of narratives that I think need to be told are to say, look, the world has changed. The 21st century is not a European-dominated century. Britain is a small, declining power. Our best chance of real power and real influence in the world is by being part of a larger entity. Secondly, if we actually had the right attitude when we go to Brussels, we could leave this institution. Yeah? Going back to my final slide, you know, the numbers of Poles, Slovaks, Czechs, others around the time of accession who were hoping for Britain to take a lead for a more open, liberal Europe. There's still a bit of that positive sentiment around, although you've all got a bit fed up with British politicians over the last few years. But I still think that that could be a narrative that's sold. That this is the way of meeting all of our challenges. We can't meet them alone, but we can within a larger union like the EU. And especially if we have the right attitude, then we can actually lead this thing. And it doesn't have to be a Franco-German plot. Yeah. So I think that would be the narrative. But the pro-European lobby have been rubbish at this so far. I can't come up with a better term than rubbish. I would probably say something ruder if we were in the pub, but which links through to the final point about TTIP. And if I may, I'll ask the question, answer it in two ways. I think if Britain were to leave, I mean, TTIP is going through difficulties at the moment, so whether TTIP will even get approved or not, I don't know. Britain actually has been one of the driving forces behind a TTIP. So if TTIP is still on the agenda by the time that Britain is possibly negotiating exit, it's going to make TTIP, it's going to make TTIP less likely, would be the first point. The second thing is, if Britain, I mean, it depends partly on these scenarios of where Britain would be and what kind of trading relationship it would have. But essentially, if Britain were to leave, then Britain has no say over these things. So the trade deal that would be struck would be beneficial for the 27 member states plus the US in that kind of way. And Britain I mean, it depends on the deal, but Britain would just have to lump with the consequences. The third thing, if I may say this, it's going slightly off topic, but I think an important point, is that the Eurosceptics think that Britain was to leave, somehow we'd be able to strike a deal. Somehow that Britain will be able to strike a trade and investment partnership with the United States. I mean, this is kind of cuckoo land. I was fortunate enough to be in New Delhi at the Indian Council for World Affairs, talking about Britain and the EU, along with two of my other colleagues, one of whom talked about EU foreign policy and one of whom talked about Europe in the 21st century. We all gave 20-minute presentations, and then there was an hour for Q&A. Now maybe it was because I gave the least interesting presentation of the three, but not a single question from any Indian was about Britain and the EU, even given the colonial ties, even given historical ties. Why? Well, if you run a country with a population of over 1 billion people, why would you bother with the time and effort to strike a trade deal with a small collection of islands where only 65 million people live, when you could be striking a deal with a bloc where 450 million people live? Yeah? In trade negotiations, simple numbers matter. I would suspect that there would still be some kind of a deal struck, a transatlantic trade. It would probably be less liberal, less open, probably less beneficial for the EU, and certainly if Britain weren't there, less beneficial for the UK.
Okay. Presentation. I just wanted to ask quickly, what do you think would Scotland do should UK leave the European Union?
What about the Welsh National Party? What are they leaning towards? Are they leaning towards leaving the EU or actually staying in?
Okay, so Celtic question. So let's start with Scotland. So if we look at the couple of things that are important to say. So firstly was the independence referendum was important, in which the Scottish, the vote to leave the EU got 45% and the vote to stay 55%. The reason why that vote was the way it was lots of last-minute promises from British politicians going up and trying to sort of scare the Scots into the possibility of leaving. After that result, what was noticeable is that a lot of people have joined the Scottish National Party. Membership increased threefold in just 3 weeks after that independence referendum. On current opinion polls, the Scottish National Party will get the largest number of seats in Scotland. Okay? This is all to really emphasise the fact that the Scots are quite keen to stay in the EU. If there's any kind of referendum to leave the EU in the UK, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see either the Scots make the argument, look, we in Scotland have voted to stay, if you look at the statistics, or to actually demand then a subsequent referendum on independence. Now here's where we get into fun hypotheticals, but why not? We're in a university, we're allowed to be hypothetical once or twice. Legally, scholars are worried that we're debating what would happen if Scotland left the UK at the time of the independence referendum. You know, here's a scenario. Britain decides to leave, but Scotland decides to stay. So Scotland just basically assumes Britain's position. Yeah? So you don't have to renegotiate the treaties per se. It will be the 28th member state. Of course, you'll have to discuss at some point allocations for a number of seats in the European Parliament and things like that. But, you know, I could possibly see that, you know, two nations, if you like, going in opposite directions. The Scots both want to basically stay in, and the rest of the UK possibly wanting to leave. I would just argue, though, that I think the likelihood of Brexit is quite low. But as public opinion is so flexible and flaky, and we all know that in referenda, you ask one question and you get an answer to several others. Usually, what do you think about the government in power at the time? But who knows what would happen? But Scotland basically is very much adamant with the idea of staying in, and it says we are a state of 5 million people. There are other EU member states of that size, if not smaller, one of which you guys in this room know extremely well. In terms of the Welsh position, the Welsh nationalists are in favour of staying in. They don't have a significantly large representation in the House of Commons, 4 or 5 seats or something like that, I think. Stand corrected on that. But they are basically in favour of staying in. Their criticism is an anti-London criticism rather than an anti-Brussels criticism.
Thank you. So my question is about the business influence on this question. Because in the Lithuanian referendum of accession to the European Union, business structures was highly important. And I'm asking about the City of London. You have shown us statistics about public opinion, about European Union. You have shown us statistics of parties, inside the parties. But what is the opinion of the City of London? And how does influential financial markets seize this matter? Can we have any influence in the referendum campaigns?
I would say that, I mean, the City of London is very keen for, it's difficult always to talk about the city as a whole. There are, of course, different opinions, but overwhelmingly, the view of the city is it would be better for Britain to stay in, partly because that means that Britain would dominate, or the City of London would dominate financial services within the EU, which is what the city really wants. So the city would argue quite hard for that. The city and international financial capital can move pretty damn quickly if it wants to, and will move pretty damn quickly if it wants to. So that's something that will be important in the campaign. More broadly, business is enthusiastic about Britain staying in. Generally, we can say that those businesses that tend to be involved more in import and export and in trade, cross-border trade, are much more enthusiastic about staying in. Some of the small business groupings are slightly less enthusiastic for the simple reason that they're not involved in that kind of cross-border trade. They don't see the benefits of the single market so much. Although even then, of course, you go into any supermarket in the UK these days and you can buy fantastic food from all over the world and lots of stuff from Europe. Now, if Britain were to leave that and you have to start paying tariffs and God knows what else on top, that may well affect prices, affect flows of things. So business generally is very much in favour of Britain remaining within the EU, and the business lobby is likely to be quite strong. I would just say that I don't think the financial lobby would be particularly persuasive, because I don't know what it's like in Lithuania, but bankers don't have the best reputation in the UK. They are seen as being responsible for the 2008 crisis. So I don't think it would be a good idea if one of the key bankers is leading the Britain should stay in. That might actually persuade some people to vote the other way.
Now we have time for the last question.
Thank you. So my question is about the business influence on this question. Because in Lithuanian referendum of accession to the European Union, business structures was highly important. And I'm asking about the City of London. You have shown us statistics about public opinion, about European Union. You have shown us statistics of parties, inside the parties. But what is the opinion of the City of London? And how does influential financial markets sees this matter? Can we have any influence in the referendum campaigns?
I would say that, the City of London is very keen for, it's difficult always to talk about the city as a whole. There are of course different opinions, but overwhelmingly the view of the city is it would be better for Britain to stay in. Partly because that means that Britain would dominate, or the City of London would dominate financial services within the EU, which is what the city really wants. So the city would argue quite hard for that. The city and international financial capital can move pretty damn quickly if it wants to. And will move pretty damn quickly if it wants to. So that's something that will be important in the campaign. More broadly, business is enthusiastic about Britain staying in. Generally, we can say that those businesses that tend to be involved more in import and export and in trade, cross-border trade, are much more enthusiastic about staying in. Some of the small business groupings are slightly less enthusiastic for the simple reason that they're not involved in that kind of cross-border trade. They don't see the benefits of the single market so much. Although even then, of course, you go into any supermarket in the UK these days and you can buy fantastic food from all over the world and lots of stuff from Europe. Now, if Britain were to leave that and you have to start paying tariffs and God knows what else on top, that may well affect prices, affect flows of things. So business generally is very much in favour of Britain remaining within the EU, and the business lobby is likely to be quite strong. I would just say that I don't think the financial lobby would be particularly persuasive, because I don't know what it's like in Lithuania, but bankers don't have the best reputation in the UK. They are seen as being responsible for the 2008 crisis. So I don't think it would be a good idea if one of the key bankers is leading the Britain should stay in. That might actually persuade some people to vote the other way.
Now we have time for the last question. Yes.
I would like to ask you about Ukraine and British response, because rhetorically Cameron was very persuasive for sanctions, but actually Angela Merkel was a leader too. So how do you comment this?
I thought it was really striking that it was Merkel and Hollande that went and not Cameron, and it was played in the British press as, you know, a sign of lack of British power. British defence funding has been cut quite significantly. Britain is probably going to struggle to meet its NATO requirement of 2%. Defence is one of those areas in the austerity budgets which have been hit hard. Britain really doesn't have that much clout anymore. In terms of how Ukraine is playing out, I have to say I think most British politicians have been rather impotent and slow on the uptake. Maybe not just British politicians, but you know, I find it quite amazing that sovereign territory was taken back. Okay, we can debate 1954 and why it was given, but Khrushchev decided to switch to Crimea, and that had virtually no resonance in the UK. Sorry, the Ukraine is probably another topic, but I think it shows, it underlines, going back to the point before, it underlines actually in this 21st century Britain is not powerful enough by itself. The only way that we're going to have any kind of clout is by working together, but then we have to ensure that any EU message is not undermined by Putin's foreign policy, which, you know, Putin seems to be very effective at the moment in playing divide and rule amongst the EU member states. Whether we look at the Czech Republic or the new Greek government or wherever, it seems quite disturbing, which I'm sure for you guys here is much more disturbing.
Well, it was also disturbing when one member of British Cabinet of Ministers woke up recently, I think it was a month ago or so, to declare publicly that Baltic states might be the other target of external aggression, when this has been debated for quite a while, not just in the Baltics, but in Europe and NATO and other forums. This was quite surprising, I would say, which probably is yet another sign of this inward orientation of British political elites.
I think so. I mean, maybe things will be better after the election. We'll see. At times of elections, everyone does look inwards. But, you know, Britain has commitments. I mean, you mentioned NATO. I mean, there is Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, you know, which means that if anyone from outside NATO puts, you know, anyone's boots lands on Lithuanian territory, then we should come to your aid, and so we should.
Well, I'm sure everyone in this room knows the Article 5.
Yeah, you guys know it better than I do. You have, is it true that conscription has been reintroduced now?
Yes.
So probably half of you in this room are very enthusiastic about that. I assume it's just for guys.
At the moment, yes, but there were debates also about something similar to Israel. This is another example which seems to inspire people here.
But there's no talk about Britain leaving NATO, unfortunately. And what I find, if I can add one point,
sure,
which I find interesting, is that, you know, Nigel Farage complains about sovereignty. And, you know, there's a perfectly legitimate argument to make about sovereignty, fine. But actually, as I say, Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, that's a real pooling of sovereignty. You are basically saying that if you invade any other NATO state, you are obliged to come to its defense. That means that there should be no debate. You have to do it. That is giving up your sovereignty, if you like. But no UKIP politician will stand up and say, well, therefore, I think we should leave NATO, therefore we should leave the UN, we should leave, you know, every international organisation which involves pooling sovereignty. They just blame the EU for everything.
But Scottish politicians have different view on NATO.
Some Scottish politicians do. The crucial difference is that the Scottish view is about nuclear weapons. So it's about getting rid of Britain's nuclear terror. And that was an issue during the referendum campaign. And Nicola Sturgeon, whose picture I put up here, was on a rally this weekend in which she was advocating again that Scotland should be free of trident in nuclear terror.